Welcome to Keeping the World Company on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today, we'll talk about exactly what is going on in Ukraine. How is the art of the deal doing in the fog of war? Our co-host for the show is Ben Davis. He is a professor of law at Washington and Lee Law School in Lexington, Virginia. Our esteemed guests for the show are Gene Rosenfeld, independent scholar, and Manfred Henningsen, emeritus professor of political philosophy, UH Manoa. Welcome to you all to the show. We need to follow the events in and around the war against Ukraine and the actions and positions taken by the players in and around that war. And what's interesting is, and Gene has mentioned this to me in the past, we're not getting as much information now. We all remember when we saw, the MSNBC hosts on the ground almost every day, almost every hour about what was going on in Ukraine. We don't see them anymore. We don't hear that much about them. So with you, I would like to examine what we know about what the various players are doing these days, and whether the war is really moving to a ceasefire, as Trump promised, or a peace agreement, or whether we have continuing conflict or just stalemate. Gene, let's start with you. What do you know about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine?
Very little, Jay. I try to comb the sources, the open sources that we have, including some open sources from Ukraine and Ukrainians. And it seems like the talks that are going on are obscured for the most part. What happens in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, with the principals from the Russian government and the United States government may or may not be conveyed in their statements after they meet. They don't seem like they're complete statements. We hear that Putin and Trump talk, it seems frequently, but we don't know what they talk about. And we can't believe what our president says, and even less so what Putin says. Consequently, the signals coming from Ukraine as to what is actually happening are weakened, and we don't have a good information stream. We assume that what is said in the newspapers is in part what the governments want them to say, because they release statements which sometimes accord with truth and sometimes can be verified and most of the time cannot. So there's kind of not exactly a blackout of information, but there's definitely a brownout of information. We sometimes can get intimations of what is happening from European leaders who speak with Zelensky. Keir Starmer of the UK is playing a very important role in mediating between Trump and Zelensky as much as possible. But although he's pretty skilled, he really is operating in the dark also, because Trump likes to rule by surprises. Therefore, the agreements that the United States has secured from Russia and from Ukraine independently concerning a ceasefire have not been in accord with one another. They've been different. And one side is blindsided in these agreements. So no agreement has been reached. And as most experts said before Trump said that he would solve the problem on day one, this is going to be a long-term process. And he's not going about it in the traditional way. So he's creating more complications, and he's getting basically, as far as I can tell, nowhere.
I heard one commentator say that right after the Signal chat scandal, Trump came up with three things in his discussions with the media. The first was that he was really ticked off at Putin. I'm softening the use of that term. And he was mad at Putin because Putin wasn't saying the right thing about Zelensky, which is a surprise because Trump had insulted Zelensky much worse. But anyway, so everybody reports that. The media goes off and circles over that. Then he says that he's going to bomb Tehran. And wow, that's pretty drastic. And the media goes off in circles on that. And finally, he says he's going to run for a third term, which the media got so excited about, called in their constitutional resources, and it came to the surprise conclusion that you can't do that. And these three things were within a day after the Signal chat scandal broke. And the commentator I'm thinking of said, wait a minute. He's just doing what he always does. He's changing the subject as he always does. And these three things are simply distraction, and we have seen it so many times in the past. Let's take it for what we know it is. The question I put to you, Ben, is what motivates Trump to lie to us, to not tell us what's going on, to not tell us the substance of his discussions with Putin and others representing Russia? What makes him do this distraction thing? Is he so concerned about telling us the truth, and why?
The thing that I think that we saw also in the run-up to the election, the thing about Trump is he attempts to tell you what you want to hear. That's the way he can promise all kinds of things that are inconsistent and all that, because it speaks to this group or that group or this one. So I think that the second thing about him is that he will say two things at the same time. On the one hand, he will say he's angry at Putin. On the other hand, in another place, he'll say, we're going to keep going with Putin or something like that, basically reducing the effect of the original comment. Now, one will be done in a place where there'll be a lot of press about it. The other one will be done maybe on Air Force One in the hallway that somebody only picks up on. So basically, all he's doing, at least it seems to me, is just trying to say to everybody what they want. So then the question is, well, besides what he's saying, what is he doing, right, with regards to what's going on there? And the thing is, you can't know. The only thing you can know is, are there weapons coming from the United States and money coming from the United States going to Zelensky? And I really wonder if that is going on, because Biden gave Zelensky an enormous amount of material that could last him for a while. And I'm just wondering whether Zelensky's running through that, or is he getting fresh stuff from the United States? I saw that Zelensky was meeting with the Germans and getting some German weapons. And, it's kind of going around like that. And there's a part of me that's thinking that Trump will say to all of us that he's going to, help Zelensky. But in practice, he's not giving Zelensky a dime. And the reason I think about that, too, is because all of a sudden the whole, the mineral deal that was supposed to be part of this doesn't seem to be moving either. Along the ceasefires doesn't seem to be moving, which suggests to me that there's something going on with regards to the United States actually doing what Trump says it's doing. Now, this may be completely out of left field, but the reason I kind of got to this was that, there was that huge earthquake in Myanmar, and somebody asked Trump about it. And he said, yes, the United States, I've been contacted, and the United States is going to do something. And I'm like, wait a minute, the principal entity that does that for the United States is what? USAID. We just destroyed USAID. So I'm not seeing any planes taking off with food or anything, or you know what I mean? And so it's like he's saying what sounds good, right? But in fact, the actual what he's doing is not that much. Finally, and again, I may be wrong, but there seems to be some information that seems to be suggesting that the war is really not going as well as Russia would like. In other words, that they're not gaining substantial amounts of territory right now. And the fact that Putin is calling up 160,000 more people sounds like, that's more cannon fodder to go into this thing. And so it's kind of a really interesting moment where if Ukraine can hang on, maybe they can defeat Russia, but the United States doesn't want Russia defeated, or Trump doesn't want Russia really defeated because Trump has interests in doing business in Russia. So it's, that's the way looking at the tea leaves it looks to me, is that basically everything we've heard about Trump, abandoning Zelensky, I think is probably still going on.
Well, Richard Wolff has written a few books about Trump. And when you assimilate all his writing and reporting and lessons, he comes up with this. Trump is always looking for attention. Everything he does is attention, and it's attention in the media. So I'd like to point out a couple of things that I saw in the media in the last few days. Number one is there was an article, I think in the Times, about the fact that Joe Biden had a secret war going on in Ukraine. And there was U.S. troops were involved in that war. And he was delivering weapons that he didn't really reveal. I think he realized, I think he did do that. They had, a notable article about it. I think he did do that, but he didn't want the public to know about it because he was afraid from a political point of view they would criticize him. Because on the one hand, he was saying no boots on the ground, and here's boots on the ground.
Yeah.
The other thing is most recently, Trump has actually said that he was delivering weapons. He relented, which as with the Myanmar example you provided, I doubt that's true. What he has done within the last couple of days is he's announced that he wants a sweeter deal for the rare earth minerals. In other words, what he was asking for before was not enough. Now he's changed his position about that. And I say to you, that's just to get the public's attention, to make himself look bad. And, just spell my name right. It's okay if I look bad. That's where he lives. So I find those things interesting, and they keep the pot boiling. But, you see examples of American dishonesty. I'm sorry. Okay, but let's move on to the other word. We talked about distraction. That's what Trump does. The other word is bluffing, and Ben referred to that. But Manfred, it seems to me that Russia's in trouble. They have to call up 160,000 troops again. No mention of the Koreans. I don't know what happened to the Koreans. The Russian economy is in the tank. Something like 40% of the entire GDP of Russia is dedicated to this war. He keeps on engaging in the war and saying he will engage in the war. And the sanctions are still in place. In fact, Trump, because of his, quote, argument with Putin, has said he was going to increase the sanctions. It seems to me that when Putin says, well, we really believe in this and we want to move in on Ukraine, we're still fighting with Ukraine, it's a bluff. Is it a bluff, Manfred, or what?
I mean, we discovered that it was a bluff when the Ukraine did not become defeated in a few months in 22. And that we all discovered, the world discovered, and the Russians discovered too, that the Russian military was not as successful as everybody thought it would be. Now, what is happening now at the front, I'm not so sure, because there is some talk about, two things. I found this article that you referred to about the really amazing involvement of the American military in strategizing the war on the ground in the Ukraine, which continued, by the way, for a few weeks, I think, when Trump became president. But I do not think you had American boots on the ground. They were all in Germany, in Ramstein and other bases in Germany. So they didn't leave uh, Germany in order to enter the Ukraine. But there is something else which I do not understand, and I haven't seen anything in American media. There is talk about a secret weapon that the Ukraine has developed that Putin and the Russian military is scared of. And that has triggered these nuclear warnings from Putin. But I have not heard or seen any detailed discussion of the secret weapon that Ukrainians have developed. It's connected with the drone network that is threatening all of Russia. But you mentioned before this tactic that Trump has developed, this distraction strategy. And today, you have the tariff distraction. When you saw the news conference, when he was holding up, the sign there with all of the countries that he is going to kick in the rear with taxes, with tariffs. That is, I think, a distraction that will keep us busy, for at least a week, if not longer. But I mean, the other one, I don't know whether Ben knows more about it, about the secret weapon that people, I have seen that in German newspapers, that the Ukrainians have developed, what it is. But it seems to be scaring really the shit out of Putin.
We have heard Putin talk about nuclear weapons all through this thing. All sizes and shapes of nuclear weapons, and how if you do this to me, I'm going to blow you up. If you do that to me, I'm going to blow you up. And of course, his attack on Zaporizhzhia, the Ukrainian power plant, nuclear power plant, is, it's a sort of an example of I don't mind using nuclear. I don't mind putting Europe at risk with nuclear fallout. My question to you, Manfred, is my reaction initially and throughout has been, that's just another bluff. He is not going to do that because he knows if he gets into a nuclear war, it's the end of what's left of Russia. Do you agree? Do you think that Putin really means it when he threatens nuclear war?
No, I think you're right. It's bluff. I mean, you have two bluffers. You have an American bluffer and you have a Russian bluffer. And I think the only realist in this bluffing game is Zelensky.
Yes.
And for that reason, I going back to your initial, well, both of you, Ben and Jay, I think the military situation for Russia is not as good as Putin wants us believe. So for that reason, I think the Ukrainians, who have surprised the world, well, not only Russia but the world since 22. Are continuing to really surprise us. And this weapon discussion that I have seen in the German newspapers, Süddeutsche Zeitung, which is very reliable, I find is very, very along those lines. That the Ukrainians have something up their sleeve that Putin is afraid of.
Let me go to something that both the words distraction and the word bluffing relates to. It's the media. In our modern times, you play to the media and you hope the media will play to public opinion, and you win the war or lose it by what you say and report to the media, or misreport, as the case may be. And therefore, when you see Trump getting up and making all these distraction remarks, when you see Putin getting up and making all these bluffing remarks, you have to realize, do you not, that they are making these remarks to the media, and the media, expecting the media to report it to their constituencies, and somehow the public opinion that is affected or changed by the distraction and the bluffing helps win or lose the war. Jean, your thoughts about that possibility?
Controlling the conversation and impressions that people get is a primary weapon of hybrid war. And we are, again, in a wider hybrid war. with now more players, not just Russia and China and the BRICS, that they would like to gather together in a contrary power consortium to the United States and the West, but also with our allies. So there are many opportunities for distraction, and the media is going to go after every ball that Putin hits at them. And he has sort of cloned all those balls, and they're all falling into the infield and outfield at the same time. So the media is distracted. On the other hand, the people in the United States seem to be very clear. And I believe that Trump is, to a certain extent, playing both sides against the middle in terms of what he is saying one day to the next about Russia, because he has his eye on the polling numbers in the United States. Even members of MAGA, even conservative Republicans who, on the surface at least, are sticking with him, and especially Republican officials in the Congress, are becoming very upset with our lack of support for Ukraine. And Trump, of course, is not able to make good on his promise. So he has to create impressions. One of the things that concerns me, though, and it is lost in all of this, and the media being both impacted by threats from the administration and distracted by all the balls hit toward them in the infield or outfield, is that the Zelensky, it seems to me, is playing for delay, delay, delay. He knows that he's got to fight a two-front hybrid war with Russia and the United States now. He knows that he doesn't want to sign away all of the resources of rare earths in Ukraine to the United States, and he doesn't want to give up Black Sea ports to Russia, and he doesn't want Ukraine to be taken over by the same model that Russia has used to take over the European satellites in the past, which is basically to hold elections, get rid of him, replace Ukrainian patriots in the military and the civil government with Russian clones in Ukraine, and effectively turn Ukraine into Belarus, incorporate it into Russia again, and have historic and greater Russia. That is the game that Putin is playing. And Zelensky, of course, is playing the counter game. He still wants Ukrainian independence and security. So he is being very clever in resisting both Trump and Putin's outreach to him. He's delaying on the deals for the rare earths, signaling that one day, yeah, he might do it, and the next day, well, maybe not. Maybe we should wait a little. He's kicking the ball down the field, so to speak. And also with respect to knowing that Russia is trying to secure these horrible conditions for a ceasefire. He's not denying that he wants a ceasefire, but he's not signing it either. And he, I think, has conveyed this to certain leaders in Europe, like Starmer and perhaps Macron and the head of the European Union. And they are playing their own quiet game. So we now have multiple parties, and we have multiple initiatives and multiple delays. And of course, nothing is really happening as a result of all that. And media is not clued in to what Russia's deeper motives and procedures are. They never are. They just report what they see on the field.
You know, Ben, the description we've had here in this discussion about what's going on, what we know and don't know, suggests to me that this is going to be a long-term thing. And Gene's thought that Zelensky's playing for delay, that may be justified. But at the end of the day, if you have a stalemate for a long time, if you have conflict for a long time, if you have the risk of an explosive war always, then you have the possibility of an expanding war. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the fact that this, 3 years now already, that this war is going to expand, and it's going to expand violence elsewhere. And it does have a relationship with violence that's going on elsewhere. I don't know what your thought is, but I'm wondering your thought about the relationship of these events in Ukraine with other conflicts, either in the Baltics, other parts of Europe, and in the Middle East. It's not healthy. I pose to you the possibility that it's not healthy to have an ongoing conflict which has no end in sight, and it can only get worse, not better. Your thoughts?
In the background, you have Russia, right, on one side, and Russia has its series of ties, um, some stronger, some less strong, in various hot points in the world right now. Yeah, there is a certain amount of interplay, I guess we would call it, or intersectionality between what's going on in Ukraine and what's going on in other places, Middle East, Africa. Um, also, we also, I think, have to keep in mind the Chinese, in certain extent. Where are they in all this? You don't hear anything about them, but at least I don't hear anything about them. But I find the Chinese play really very interesting diplomatic games themselves. But if I think about where there could be some tensions or arising, you come back to the typical Russian, probably for 300, 400 years approach, which, is to look towards the Baltics, right, and look towards Poland. There's bringing up ties with Hungary. It's that near Eastern Europe, trying to have influence in it. I know that the only thing I can think of that, in the Middle East, there's the Israeli situation with Gaza. And, I found it interesting that Orban has invited Netanyahu to Hungary and is not going to, impose the ICC arrest warrant. And I always think of Orban as being kind of the quasi-satellite, so almost like the Jaruzelski of Hungary back in the day, when Jaruzelski was in Poland running that for Moscow, right? So, how that line through is being played, I'm not quite sure, but it's I guess I don't have a very clear answer, except that I do sense the Putin in the background pulling or pushing things in different parts of the world. There's another thing that I read recently, which I think may be related to this, and I'm not sure, okay? But I've been reading that they're saying that Putin is sick. And so the logic of Zelensky drawing this out would be pretty evident if they think that Putin is sick, that the longer it goes on, the sicker he's likely to be. Maybe that makes him erratic too, but it's, there's just a loss of all the capacity to dominate just because physically he's got something. I don't know, but that I remember seeing that as being something that's being breached around, just like this idea of the Ukrainian secret weapon. I don't know, but something I think about.
Let me add to what you were saying, that there was an article recently about how the Chinese have stepped up their overflights on Taiwan. And this happened right after the signal chat scandal. So whatever it is, something is encouraging them. And I bet their timeline is shorter now. Who knows? Manfred, let me go to you. We've talked so many times about whether Europe can stay together, be together, act together, build a defense force, a security force together. And everything I see leads me to believe that that's not so easy for Europe. They can do the rhetoric, but can they actually do that? Can they galvanize their manufacturing of weapons? Can they collect the money from various nation states to really make a difference? And of course, you always hear, the The bottom line is that the U.S. is more powerful, has a bigger military, is really the fulcrum of all of this. And by the way, Trump is asking for another $4 trillion, for the military. He says we don't have enough money to carry on, but he's asking $4 trillion for our American military. And so you really wonder if they're right to worry that without the U.S. and all the trillions of dollars, which are cumulative, in my opinion. In other words, you give $900 billion every year. Well, sure, that's to pay salaries and ongoing repeating expenses, but it's also to build. And I think the U.S. has built and is building, especially with $4 trillion more, a huge military. That would make a big difference for NATO. But it's not committed, and Trump won't commit it. And so we have Europe alone, and we have Europe, which is, by some indications, fragmented. So I put the same question to you that we've discussed so many times in the past. Will Europe follow through to support Ukraine, or is that a dream that won't come true?
No. They will. People are waiting now for the German government to come together. And that will take maybe another 2 weeks. And their support for the Ukraine is solid. And I think when you're looking at the 27 states of the EU together, there are a few troubled places. Hungary, Slovakia, and Serbia is not part of the EU. It's an applicant like some of the others. But you have, I think, a solid Scandinavian, you could say all the countries that surround the Baltic Sea. In a way, you could say the Baltic Sea has become a NATO sea, with the exception of Kaliningrad and Petersburg, the two Russian harbors. All of the surrounding territory of the Baltic Sea is NATO country. And I think the sentiments within those countries, including, I think, France and, strangely enough, Great Britain also, are solidly behind supporting the Ukraine. So for that reason, I do not talk about the fragility or frailty or whatever you want to use to characterize European attitudes. I think it's solid. Now, Italy may be a little bit, Italy is also, Meloni is supporting Zelensky, but she somehow is hesitant to support, the creation of a European military force. Even though it exists anyway, but going independent of NATO. Europe has no choice. Once the US leaves NATO, they have to.
Are you saying that Donald Trump will respect the contractual obligations of the United States?
No, I don't
to
think
NATO?
so.
Because I don't think there's anybody in this great wide world that would agree with that.
You cannot trust him. You can. The trust for Trump's America is completely gone. And now, with the tariffs, this has got even more confirmed. But you're always asking the question whether Europe will be able. When you're looking at the Baltic states, for example, I remember when I was there in 2017 and talking to the foreign minister of Latvia, and he said, we are sitting here in a marketplace in Riga, and the Russians are 2 hours away. But one other fascinating thing about the Baltic states is they all have huge Russian-speaking minorities. But I think what Putin really has succeeded in doing is to make these Russian minorities become more anti-Russian than the ethnic countries in which they live. They don't want to become part of Putin's Russia, even if they are speaking Russian. I mean, look, you have Russian-speaking Ukrainians here living in Honolulu. And when you talk with them about that, they said, well, look, this is the language we have been using in our family, but that is not a kind of nationalist identification medium. Quite the contrary. So for that reason, I'm not afraid of Europe breaking up as if any kind of threats.
A lot of Europeans are afraid of that, and they're afraid of Trump undermining their European economy.
No,
those tariffs are going to hurt Europe.
Right.
And if Europe has declining economies, it won't have the, what do you want to call it, the resources to mount a campaign against Russia.
No, let's not. No, I will not speculate in that direction, and I do not think that the economies of most, especially of Germany,
Well, the big driver of German economy is all the car makers, and all the car makers in Germany are in trouble because of
but
Trump.
you have all kinds of other features of the German economy that are money making.
One more question before we move on to Gene, and that is, you've indicated that we're waiting to see Europe come together. We're waiting to see these leaders emerge and have a workable plan against Putin. Hasn't happened yet. We're waiting. And my question to you, Manfred, is whether time works in favor of Europe getting its act together and in favor of Ukraine, getting the support that he wants from Europe.
It's not a time question. I think it's a question of political will. And I think this political will exists. And in that sense, you could say Europe has to thank both Trump and Putin for giving them the motivations, to do what they have to do. Now, whether that will lead to a stronger political union, as was anticipated in the 50s. I mean, remember in the 50s that economic union of the 6 states was going to be enlarged by a military union. And the French National Assembly voted that down. And from that moment on, in the 50s, it was 55. From that vote on, you have had this problem with the European military. I mean, de Gaulle wanted to take France out of NATO, and in a way he succeeded to some extent. But no, I think I'm really happy about Trump and Putin doing so much propaganda for European Union.
Okay, but let me go to Gene. Gene, Marine Le Pen got convicted and she's out of the running right now. That's good. But Macron is still coming to an end of his term. Macron is stronger in the short term, but in the long term, he's got to leave. His government is finished. The democracy, Germany is a democracy, the UK is a democracy, and in democracies, the leadership changes. Power is passed to the next generation of leaders. So my question still concerns me. Does time work in favor of Europe getting its act together? All the while, Putin is trying to undermine these Western European countries by hybrid, techniques. There was a scandal about his sabotage of companies and military units in the UK, which he apparently has been doing on a regular basis. He's a busy fellow. So how do you feel about the possibility that Europe will be together, that time will not work against it, but for it, and to support Ukraine?
Well, I was going to bring up the issue of Marine Le Pen because it appears to me that in an age of incoherent attacks on stable alignments and defense mechanisms that the West has developed over 80 years, in light of that, the Europeans are waking up to the fact that not only do they have to counter the United States and Russia together, but they have to also counter the extreme radical right parties in their midst, like the National Front in France, headed up by Le Pen, and the AfD in Germany, and the many others. They have to, in some sense, clean that house out politically too. So Marine Le Pen was sentenced by the court to 4 years for corruption, I believe. And she has to serve 2 of those years, but she has a suspended sentence, at least for the first 2 years. And I read this as an attempt by Macron, who is actually not a bad operator in terms of politics, as French president, not prime minister now, as an attempt on his part to wound the National Front, which is in first place in France. It's as if somebody had sentenced the head of MAGA when Trump was out of office to 4 years. And so I think what's happening is that the European states that are independent and strong, like Germany, France, to some extent Britain, which is weaker than it used to be, definitely the Scandinavian states, and to some extent Italy, while others sort of stand by and watch, that they are cleaning house. They are hoping for the time to develop the strength they need, both financially and militarily, to unite, if necessary, in a NATO-like alliance, if NATO still does not exist or is a dead letter, in order to support Ukraine, because I don't think the European states can abide Russia taking over Ukraine. Ukraine is a very big piece of territory, a very important and resource-rich piece of territory, and it is strategically located. So that's going on. And again, we're not getting mainstream media coverage of all of this. We're getting bits and pieces. And as an analyst, I have to read all the bits and pieces, and I'm sure Ben and Manfred do too, and try to put them together and see actually what is really going on.
Well, I wanted to get to that point with Ben. You know, it seems to me that the American public doesn't care that much about Ukraine. Maybe there are some, we do, but not everybody does. And since the American public is divided on along Trump lines, you know that it's not going to be a universal support among the American public, and the media reflects that. If the people don't care, then the media doesn't care. It's not part of the bubble, so to speak. If the public is interested, the media will cover it. You can quote me on this. If the public is not interested, the media will not cover it. And I think we're not getting the same coverage as we had before. And it's really too bad, because we should be. This is a very important war, invasion. On the other hand, if you look at Europe, you get better information. Not because necessarily everybody's together on the issue, but because it's closer physically, geographically closer. And so it's a good idea for the media to report on it and for people to be informed on it. So my question to you is, how does this affect the ultimate result here? If, as time goes, again, it's a time question, if we go down the road and we see stalemate, we don't know what's going on, and we know some agencies, some media are going to report more and some less, how does that affect the future of the support that Ukraine hopes to get?
The way I look at it is, to the extent you had under the Biden administration a strong support for Ukraine vision, that manifested itself in the press report at the time. Now, under Trump, we're understanding that he's got maybe ambivalence at minimum towards really strong support towards Ukraine. And consequently, because there isn't that kind of strong commitment at the top, it kind of fritters away into the American population to a certain extent. And so therefore, we don't care as much. Why? Because the leader doesn't care as much about Ukraine. The other thing I would say just about the United States is that since everything is refracted into politics in a way that is kind of crazy, if I can say it like that, you know, it's so hard to have the kind of constancy of purpose being expressed by our federal government. So the end result is the population kind of doesn't know which way to turn. I do think, though, that on the whole, there are large, significant majorities, even among Republicans, if I remember right, in support of Ukraine. I mean, there's an effort to try to turn Russia into the victim too, right? I don't think that's working with American people. American people understand who's the good guy and who's the bad guy in this, in their vision. Whether they want to really be committed to doing a lot about it, that's the other thing. That's like the pocketbook issue, right? You say, we got a warm feeling for Mr. Zelensky, but we don't have a warm feeling for taking some money out of our own pocket to help him out, which is a classic American kind of hypocrisy, if I could say it like that. But that ambivalence you see, I think, is derived from the top. And one thing I would say about being derived from the top is when you talk about the media, you have to speak to the fact that the media that follows the White House is being reorganized to have certain kinds of outlets have more access than the traditional mainstream media, outlets that are very supportive of Trump's vision. So you're seeing a further blurring, if I could say it like that, with regards to the messaging about what we want to do in with regards to Ukraine, and that comes into the population too, as creating ambivalence. So
Yeah, you wonder about the dynamic, Manfred, in Russia itself. I mean, the economy is not getting better. The sanctions are still in place, whatever that's worth, although I don't believe Trump when he says he's going to increase the sanctions. But the fact is that they're a losing country economically, and they're a losing country militarily. They've lost hundreds of thousands of their youngest and best, and the future of the country. They lost them. And so over time, maybe time works in favor of Ukraine. On the other hand, Ukraine is a mess. Ukraine has been bombed, everywhere. Its institutions have been destroyed. Its morale hasn't necessarily felt that yet, but you wonder how long they can last. So I want to ask for your final thoughts because we're almost out of time, Manfred. But I'm hoping you can address the competing narratives, the competing dynamics between Putin and Zelensky.
We don't know much about the debates that are going on in Russia itself. I mean, the reporting about the mood of the Russian people is very scarce and very underdeveloped. We know figures, 700,000 to 800,000 casualties, dead or wounded. We know about 400,000 for the Ukraine, but it seems that the impact, the emotional and political impact of these casualties, becomes known for the Ukraine, but not for Russia. But and we don't have people like Navalny, who could have informed us. I'm sure there are a lot of Navalny's, active in Russia today, and we will get a flood of information about that someone in the future. So for that reason, I'm somewhat hesitant, to make any predictions about that. I think maybe the situation in Russia is worse than we think it is, and that Putin may be the guy who knows that, whether he is now sick or not is not really an issue. We don't know whether Trump is sick. He's mentally not quite all right. We know that. His niece has written books about that a few times, and she's a psychologist, so she should know. But for that reason, I do not want to make a prediction.
Well, let me ask Jean if she wants to make a prediction. I'm not optimistic that she wants to make a prediction, but but let me only say that just strikes me from what you said, Manfred, that time goes by, and the one thing that you can be sure of, especially now, is that new leaders will emerge. Old leaders will get sick and go off the stage, but new leaders will emerge. And I suggest to you we're probably close to that now. We're close to it in Russia, and we're close to it in Ukraine, and for that matter in Europe, and maybe, just maybe in the US. So new leaders will carry new messages. Anyway, Jean, your final thoughts today.
Well, I think we've talked about time. I think we have to conceive of time as a weapon of war in this case. Ukraine is fighting a two-front battle, and Zelensky is using time, delay, as much as possible, ambiguity, to throw sand in the face of his two adversaries. The two adversaries are really not allies in adversariadom, if I can make up a word. They are not working together, they're working against one another to some extent, because Trump plays in different spheres. If you look at the tariffs and you align that with countries that we're friendly to and not friendly to, he's tariffing countries much harder than we should, even countries that he gets along with. So he's, on the one hand, he's alienating people. On the other hand, he's trying to negotiate with them and find a way out of the conundrums that he promised he would take care of, like the wars in the Middle East. And I will add up also, the Middle East is heating up. Ukraine is a backwater right now for Trump. He can't resolve it, and he won't resolve it for quite a while. Zelensky is still hanging on, and Ukraine is hanging on. There's no doubt that things are going on in Russia we don't know about, but we can believe that Russia is facing a type of Afghanistan situation, which brought down the Soviet Union. Is one of the three things that Navalny credits with bringing down the Soviet Union was the war in Afghanistan. And we know what the war in Vietnam did to us. So stalemate can't help Russia at all. But the Middle East is now becoming a flashpoint, with Trump saying he wants possibly to attack Iran, with Netanyahu proceeding with Trump's okay in clearing out Gaza, with Saudi Arabia being bolstered by the United States as a player on the world stage. We're getting a whole new realignment in the Middle East, and potential wars increasing in the Middle East. So it's an unstable situation. Time is not on the side of either Trump or Putin. We are getting new leaders emerging in the United States. They will emerge also in Russia, but we can't tell because the lid is on so tight there that they can't show their faces. And there's nobody of the stature of Navalny. Navalny was extremely creative, extremely charismatic, extremely effective, which is why he had to be killed. But his death is a kind of martyrdom, and he becomes an influence in his death as well. We just don't know the extent of it.
Okay, Ben, can you make some kind of assimilation of all this? Can you looking at all the things, all the issues and points and vectors and factors that have been considered? What are your thoughts? Where's this going? I mean, stalemate cannot last. Static situations in history cannot last. Maybe you're less reluctant to make a prediction than these other guys.
Well, the thing that kept coming back to me as I was listening to Jean and Manfred was I was remembering the CIA estimates of the Soviet Union's power before the Berlin Wall came down. And those CIA estimates, if I remember right, grossly overstated the power of the Soviet Union. I mean, to levels of, it looked more like they were doing things so they could get bigger budgets rather than actually reality, right? And so whether it's the manner in which the Soviets presented themselves, or it was this sort of internal CIA preservation to budgets thing, there was this like overstatement that was huge. I mean, at a level that I think we were all shocked at just how badly they had misread the Soviet economy. So there's part of me that says we are badly misreading inside of Russia right now. We've got the Putin thing. I'm not minimizing, but in terms of to what extent is the inside of Russia staying on its feet because the Chinese and the Indians are buying Russian oil? Okay, that's but outside of that, I don't know. So, I do think that it's a fragile moment for Russia, and I can't. If I could predict the future, I'd be a rich man. Okay, but the only thing I can do is say that when you look at it, you get a sense that who's got the staying power in terms of will and who doesn't. And my sense is that the Ukrainians have the will because it's their land that the Russians don't have. And that's a big thing. That's a big thing for me.
I remember reading on more than one occasion that the Russians distinguished themselves, the military especially, by painting the grass green.
Yeah.
Which is not an honest approach. And I was going to say here at the end of our show that that's the distinction point, that the Russians paint the grass green. But you know what? I'm not so sure about that anymore. I think the Trump administration also paints the grass green.
Yeah.
So there's no particular advantage or disadvantage. They're both, in a strange way, on the same page. Okay, we're out of time. Ben Davis, law professor at Washington and Lee in Lexington, Virginia. Our co-host, Gene Rosenfeld, independent scholar. Manfred Henningsen, emeritus professor of political philosophy at UH Manoa. Thank you so much to all of you. I'm Jay Fidell, host of Keeping the World Company. We've been discussing exactly what is going on in Ukraine. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha.